Okie doke, we will get going. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining our first Lunch and Learn session of 2026. This one is all about the critical role of the building safety manager, as the title suggests. So first of all, in terms of a bit of an audience participation, if everybody could hit the thumbs up emoji if you identify as a building safety manager, that would be good. Lots of hands going up. Fantastic, wonderful. And I think we'll come on to why that's so important over the course of this presentation. And then if you have questions, please can you drop them in the chat or put your hands up, and we'll run through the presentation with my guest Ben first, and then we'll flip over to a chat and hands up. We won't sort of stop on the way through unless there's a fire alarm or something ridiculous. So let's get going. So first of all, welcome to Ben. Ben is a chartered clerk of works. I hope I've got that right, Ben. Director of Fortis and Charter. And well, probably best for me to ask Ben to explain how he's involved in this whole world and his view on compliance and assurance firstly, and then we'll get going with the.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. First of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to integrate with the people that have joined this meeting. I think it'd be very interesting to see some of the outputs. As you quite rightly said, I'm Director of Fortis and Charter. I'm a charter building engineer. I'm a qualified clerk of works. My background is in building control compliance, quality compliance, risk management and mitigation for insurers, as well as health and safety, housekeeping, etc. during live projects. My integration into this world is through Fortis and Charter. We saw a opportunity, a responsibility with our client set to ensure that they are ready for the Building Safety Act. They are ready for all elements of it, whether it be Gateway 2, 3, but in the context of this meeting, occupation and ongoing maintenance, risk mitigation and readiness. And it's been an interesting journey to date. We'll get more into it, but that's essentially my background.
Fantastic, thanks, Ben. Awesome. So, and I think for everybody for anyone that doesn't know me, I run the Building Safety Register and track my risks. Between those two things, Building Safety Register is primarily about safety case report management. Track my risks is golden thread, and the two of those together is an end-to-end solution for building safety case management and compliance with the Building Safety Act. So that's what we do, primarily software, a bit of consulting that goes with it, and working with organisations like Ben's to actually deliver. I can see other people on the call like Melissa, working with Melissa and other partners to deliver the solution that the regulator requires. So that's us. A little bit of history about the building safety manager. We all talk about building safety managers and going way back to 2018, so Dame Judith Hackett's Building a Safer Future report, I think is where the first inklings of this new role in building safety came from, the building safety manager in regards to what would then become the Building Safety Act. And it was very clear that she laid down that you've got to have the right skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours to manage day-to-day building safety. You would be a named point of contact for residents. You would have a legal duty holding position. There has to be one appointed, and it has to be clear who that is. And everybody accepted that, and we moved towards the Building Safety Act to the point that the government did their impact assessment in July 2020, where again, appointment of a competent building safety manager, provide funding for a building safety manager, etc., were requirements, and that was costed, and we'll come on to the costings later. The draft Building Safety Bill came along at the same time, which again clearly laid out in law the role of and the appointment of the building safety manager in law in the primary legislation. And then a strange thing happened. Campaigning was ongoing from largely resident groups against the legal duty holder role of the building safety manager on the basis of cost, and that ultimately led to the government pulling the role of building safety manager from the legislation. So that was done by Michael Gove, And you'll see the third line down that says leaseholders say requirement would cost high-rise residents £60,000 a year. Now, if we actually turn to the impact assessment that you can see at the top of the screen, effectively the government was saying that a building safety manager would be able to look after anywhere between 7 and 11 buildings. In another part of it, they talk about 10. And the cost of a building safety manager was considered at that time to be about 60,000 a year. So in broad terms, about £6,000 per building for the cost of a building safety manager based on the impact assessments, not the £60,000 a year that was reported, which was the purported salary cost of a building safety manager. And later on, I'll show you some benchmarking that we've done about actual costs in reality. But that's where I'm afraid all of you building safety managers out there, your role was extinguished or written out of law in March 2022. But as you all know, because you're on this call, the requirement has remained the same. You're just not in the legislation. So that's a little bit of the history, which I hope everybody knows, but just in case you didn't, that's the chronology of it. So there is not a single mention of the building safety manager in the Building Safety Act now, but as we are all acutely aware, the role of the building safety manager is actually absolutely critical to the delivery of regulatory compliance, delivery of safety for residents in our buildings. However, the role of the building safety director is in the legislation under section 111, and this is a duty holder role for resident management companies. It's whereby you can effectively pay a building safety director, a remunerated building safety director, and then that building safety director will assume all legal liability for building safety and compliance with the Building Safety Act. So effectively, the amateur directors can absolve themselves from liability by appointing a building safety director. The problem with that is that it's not legally enforceable. The government have never issued secondary legislation or regulations to actually tell anybody how you can avail yourselves of that service, should that service be required. There was a consultation in November 2022, which finished in February 23. That consultation has never been responded to by the government, and there's been no regulatory response. So at the moment, that role of the Building Safety Director is flapping around in law, and there are organisations trying to set up to provide that service, but there is all legal advice shows, and the latest advice from the TPI and the MHCLG as well has said, this is not legal. There is no legal basis to actually properly provide that service. So maybe that's something we'll come on and talk about later. But it just seems ironic to me that the role that is being done has been taken out of legislation. The role that cannot be done remains in the legislation. And on that point, the role and the duties of the building safety manager, whatever you choose to call that role, on behalf of the principal accountable person, persists, grows, is becoming clearer over time, but that requirement to do that work remains. It did not disappear with the swipe of the pen, and therefore probably the costs associated with that duty holder role being removed did not get taken out of the equation when it comes to delivering compliant buildings within the building or underneath the Building Safety Act. Some of the key responsibilities of the BSM role, as you know, one is the management of the safety case report, which is submitted along with mandatory occurrence reporting and resident engagement strategy to the regulator when they call your building forward for assessment. Management, maintenance and population of the golden thread of building safety information. Again, this is an area that I talk about a lot. We provide a service for, and one that typically most threads are not very golden. They will never be perfect, probably, apart from I can think of one client that is pretty much perfect, but most of them, it's always a work in progress. But the point is you should be showing that golden thread developing, being populated, being kept alive. It isn't just something that you tick a box and say you've done and then ignore. Mandatory occurrence reporting, running that process, and managing resident engagement. So I think they're the key elements of the BSM role. Within all of that, there's risk assessment, there's on-site inspections, there's meetings, there's lots of stuff that goes on site. And Ben and I were talking about this. He's down in London at the moment, I think. Ben, you just quickly, you looked at the building, I think yesterday, didn't you? That was somewhat different to how it had been described on paper. Is that right?
Yes, I did. To keep I won't name any names for obvious reasons, but the context is that we're there or thereabouts now with the golden thread for this particular building, with the building safety case in terms of its formation. And yesterday, I took the opportunity to visit the building firsthand. Needless to say, based on Matt's introduction, that my findings weren't what we've got in the case. So I think, and I can give examples of that, Matt, but I don't know, is now the time to do that, or do we dive into that later?
I think we'll probably dive into it later, but I think the key point is around assurance, isn't it? And actually that key role of actually making sure that what people may describe on paper actually translates into the real world and is being maintained. I think it's really important.
It is important, and it comes in various forms. It comes in communication internally. To build a safety case with someone like myself or with Matt or whoever, and then not relay the same to your on-site staff, not communicate that through every element of that building's function, undermines the whole point of it. And it was very quick to determine that that was the case in this instance. So I won't go much further than that at this point, but this is a practical issue as well as a written solution.
Perfect, thank you. So, and this slide here, I think I've got a more sensible slide as the next one, but in terms of competence. But this is my take of the role of BSMs as superheroes, as I call them. So I think you're straddling or riding a number of horses. So one of them is the requirement for technical knowledge, the being able to read and assimilate technical documents, understand them, understanding building safety risk, and that the technical side of how a building works, how safety systems work, etc. Translating jargon is a key attribute of the role. There is also, and this is the bit that really was overlooked by Dame Judith and our Lords and Masters that created the legislation, is the unique challenges of building management, multi-occupancy living. The fact that the thinking that might prevail on an oil rig, for example, does not prevail in a multi-occupancy leasehold block. We have hoarding, we have all sorts of things that go on that change the risk profile of the building. And I think all good building managers, building safety managers that I've come across, understand those nuances and understand what happens in the real world. The fact that the cable company come in and start clumping holes through compartment walls, that sort of thing. This is real life. People steal stuff, people block stuff up, people wreck things, and a lot of people are very good, and they report and they nag and they complain. This is the life or the world that we work in. And then in between that, we have the regulation and understanding which bit of overlapping law am I dealing with here? What powers do I have or don't I have under which prevailing piece of legislation that is either, standalone or duplicates other laws that already exist, and what does the regulator think about this week, bearing in mind where their latest focus is as they're embryonic and growing. So I think being able to bring all of that together, I would say you guys are one of them, my little superhero BSM here, and what you're ultimately trying to do for your residents and for your organizations that you work for is to ensure that they're regulator ready. And this is the key thing that I want to keep coming back to, that at some point, based on tranching, your buildings will get called forward for building assessment, the back process. That does not absolve you from being regulator ready or compliant with the law just because you think, well, maybe building X won't get called forward for a couple of years. The requirement to meet your Part 4 duties started 2 years ago. We're already 2 years into this process. And what we're seeing is for all sorts of good and bad reasons, a lot of the progress that should be being made is not being made as yet. Whereas some clients are way ahead of where most are. It really is a varied picture. I guess, Ben, that's really what we spend a lot of time talking about, isn't it? It's about, on particular cases, how far away are we from being regulator ready for a particular building or a particular organisation?
It is. I think it's important to mention that certainly from my perspective, I meet people at different levels in terms of where they're at on this, and I know that's something you're going to touch on later. And what is essential to do in those instances is identify the strengths and weaknesses of that position and start filling in those gaps fairly quickly. As you say, buildings can be called forward at any point. We are 2 years in, it could be tomorrow. And in that instance, we need to be as ready, or the building needs to be as ready as possible, for obvious reasons. Going back to what I mentioned just earlier, my visit to site yesterday proved that point. I've got risk assessments, I've got resident engagement strategies, I've got mandatory reporting procedures. But when I started to dig into that and ask the competencies of the people managing those systems yesterday, that wasn't able to be presented to me. Now, that is obviously part of the process that we carry out within this system, and those are things that I asked that question on purpose because I knew there wasn't an answer. Had I been the regulator, I think the outcome would have been much different. So readiness is really important. It doesn't matter where you are now. I think what is important that you start to fill in those gaps very quickly to get as ready as possible. As you mentioned, there are some more complicated elements of that, but that's why we're here. If anyone needs any help with that, more than happy to be involved.
I think at the moment, my observation would be that I think there is a reliance on the regulator not being particularly effective or efficient in terms of getting to these buildings. And I'll come on to some stats in a minute, but in terms of progress. But again, that does not absolve you of the legal responsibility. And it may be that your building is called forward later than you expected. So in theory, you've got more time to get ready. But it may also be one that the regulator decides to change the order in which it calls forward buildings. It might do that just because it chooses to, but it may also do it based on complaints or mandatory occurrence reporting, or God forbid, an actual significant incident on the site, in a building in terms of a loss of life incident or a near miss or whatever. So in theory or in practice, all buildings should be regulator ready at a moment's notice. If they call you forward for a building assessment certificate, building assessment, you will have a 28-day notice period to submit that information to the regulator. My understanding is if they investigate you because of an incident or a complaint or whatever, then I would be surprised if there's any notice at all. In theory, they could just turn up and start asking questions. I haven't seen any evidence of that happening yet, but it could. In which case, if you're at a point 2 or 3 years in where you haven't even started this process, I think that's going to be very difficult from a defensibility perspective. Just on the numbers in terms of being regulator ready, as at the 1st of December 2025, of all of the building assessment certificate applications that have been determined, so a decision has been taken by the regulator, 73% of those failed. So I would say that 73% of people in that first wave were not regulator ready. They did not manage to satisfy the regulator that their Part 4 duties were being met. Now, there may well be a counter argument, and probably is, that the regulator didn't follow correct procedure on their side, potentially, and I think those assertions have been made to me. But ultimately, for whatever reason, only 27% of those buildings in the first 614 that have been determined, only 27% of those satisfied the regulator to the point that they got an assessment certificate, a pass, effectively, a certificate issued. But in terms of regulator performance, That's 614 decisions out of just over 13,000 buildings that need to be assessed. And as at the 1st of December, only 1,838 of 13,000 had been called forward for determination. So in rough numbers, 33% of the buildings called forward for determination had reached a decision. And that's just under 2 years into BACs being called forward. So it would be 2 years in April that the first one started getting called forward. So they are a long way behind. And I think my rough calculation is that the 5-year cycle of determinations that effectively was agreed under the Building Safety Act, if they carry on at this level of trajectory, will probably be 7.5 to 8 years rather than 5. But we will have to see. They might pick up the pace later on. We will see, but there's they're significantly behind where they should be. So I think we're probably going to see, as this year goes on, probably an acceleration in the number of buildings being called forward. Otherwise, they'll never catch up with where they were. A more sensible approach to competence is, what do PASs and standards say? What does training say? So there is a publicly available specification called PAS 8673 for building safety management, and it's built on 6 pillars of competence, which are on the screen now. And I think they make sense in terms of the attributes that are required to manage building safety. That's all very good. The document itself is particularly underwhelming. It's 10 pages in total, and 6 pages of it are title pages, blank pages, and indexes. So effectively, there's about 4 pages of meat within this document that is how you should manage building safety. But it has led to the production of a number of courses. The main one that most people know about is the CIOB, Chartered Institute of Building, Level 6 Diploma in Building Safety Management. It's one way. Not all organisations put everybody through this. Not everybody has this, because ultimately you may well be bringing in specialists that understand intimately each of those different pillars of competence, and together they make up a solution. And I'm sure there's probably a number of people on the call today that are either going through this diploma or have passed it. Differing levels of feedback as to how effective it is, but that's the main sort of industry standard educational route that we've got. There are different delivery models that we're seeing. So the first one, as it says, is in-house. So this is where an organisation that manages typically multiple higher risk buildings will recruit building safety managers, safety case managers, director of building safety. They might build some software or repurpose some existing software they have in-house, and they build a capability to deliver building safety management across their portfolio. There are a number that have a hybrid approach where they have a slightly smaller team in-house, and then they work with external third-party providers. They might outsource some of their software requirements, etc. And then we have a number that just go entirely outsourced. So they might be a large PAP, a freehold owner or whatever, and they just say that I'm going to outsource the entire provision of this building safety management function to a managing agent or a third party, and we get involved across all aspects of this landscape. What you can't do in any of those is outsource your liability under the legislation. So ultimately, the principal accountable person will always be the one with the legal liability, unless, of course, we do bring in building safety directors legally, as I talked about earlier, for resident management companies, in which case you can argue your way out of that. But in most cases, the principal accountable person will be the one with the legal responsibility. They may be able to flow some of this liability through contracts, but you're not going to, worst case scenario, get your service provider to go to prison for you if prison time is required or an unlimited fine is required. So ultimately there is no getting out of this if the regulator decides that it wants to go through the courts and enforce its powers. I spoke earlier about the costs and what the impact assessment said and what people thought things were going to cost. And we've done over the last few weeks quite a bit of benchmarking with some of our clients, and this is an open offer to anyone else on the call that wants to get involved in some confidential benchmarking with us in terms of what does it actually cost to run building safety management program at scale, and what we've included in the costs is effectively the incremental costs. So the people that are recruited dedicated to building safety management, so building safety managers, safety case managers, software, not one-hit structural assessment costs, for example, or retrospective fire strategies, things that you might have to commission to be able to write your safety case. We haven't included those because they're really different depending on the actual running cost. And then we've also factored in the regulatory cost, which at the moment for a regulator's determination of a building assessment certificate is £23,000, which again is 52% higher than the worst case scenario in the impact assessment. So we've taken the £23,000, and then effectively what we've done is taken that cost and divided it by the 5-year life cycle of back to back. So effectively your building assessment certificate should be reviewed and renewed every 5 years. So we've taken that 5-year view, and at the moment we're looking at a range, and again it's outlined, of between £15,000 and £25,000 per year per higher risk building. We would like to broaden the sample a lot more so we can actually sort of hopefully narrow that range or put more sort of meat on the bone in terms of the scientific validity of that. But this is a recurring cost. Some people will be a lot higher, some people will be a bit lower, but this is where we're landing at the moment. So again, in the Q&A, it'd be really good to maybe have a bit of a chat about that. I mean, Ben, how are you seeing that in comparison to to your experience in terms of that number?
I think the figures that you presented there we're certainly operating within that bracketry at the moment, but it is variable depending on where you find people at, and as you mentioned, you've excluded the one-off costs, if you will, for retrospective strategies, for redrawing of plans on legacy works, etc. And they do obviously have an impact. My one point on this, and it's a conversation that I have with all of my client base, is that whilst money is a real thing, I appreciate that, and it has to be planned for and it has to be cash flowed, etc. But the cost of not being ready is significantly higher than what you see before you. The impact of not being in a defensible position, if challenged by the regulator, God forbid, in the worst case scenario of a fatal incident, is significant. And I think that's sort of the way that this has to be looked at the moment. Naturally, as with any other business across the board, as these things become more streamlined, as the parameters, as the data comes in, as you've already alluded to, Matt, these figures are going to become more assured. But at the moment, I would say that we're aligned.
Yeah, it's a very good point about the cost effect. The reason we're doing this is if we all are bought into the thinking that by having a maturing safety case for a particular building is going to make residents safer, you are going to reduce the risk of a significant fatal incident or a significant incident for people. If we believe that premise, then if you get this wrong or you don't do it, then this money pales into insignificance. This is you've killed people. You're responsible for people's life safety, and I don't think you can put any price on that, really. So yeah, an interesting point, well made. We have to get this right, but similarly, we can't get this right at scale if it bankrupts everybody in the process. So there has to be an efficient way of delivering the outcome without bankrupting everybody along the way, which is, I think, part of the problem with this regime. I I've always said it is hideously expensive. But that's not to say we shouldn't be spending the money, but I think we need to understand that this is a very, very expensive regime to fall within. So yeah, that's good. So how mature is your program? We've spent quite a lot of time of thinking about the evolution of safety case or safety management program in terms of a sort of evolutionary scale. So stage one is we're kind of, well, it's sort of interesting. I've heard a bit about it. We're thinking about it. And there are quite a lot of people and a lot of buildings that are in that thinking stage, aware of it, but haven't got off the blocks yet. Then comes into, well, we're in that early draft stage. We're starting to write something up. We're starting to commit pen to paper. We're pulling documentary evidence together, but we don't really have what we would describe as being building assessment certificate ready or back ready, which is where we really should be with the majority of buildings by now. They should be back ready. They should be within 28 days of submission to the regulator, if called, as a kind of a minimum line in the sand. If the regulator comes to us tomorrow and says, right, you've got 28 days to put these 2 buildings forward for assessment, we should be within 28 days of being able to submit that information to the regulator. And I think that's a good place for people to measure themselves against. Where are you on that scale across your portfolio? And if you don't know, then ask. If you think you're back ready, then we're quite happy, and I'm sure you are, Ben, and we do this for clients, is to come and test that. So you think you're back ready, we'll come and kick the tires and do that as a critical friend, as opposed to the regulator in real time. I mean, we were talking about that a few weeks ago, Ben. Do you want to have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think first of all, if you're not sure, ask. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a complex system, and it's a new thing, even though it's 2 years old, where we're still trying to set the parameters on what back ready looks like. But I would say, broad stroke, that it means that there is a comprehensive understanding of the function of that building and its safety elements, and there is evidence to prove it. And evidence is everything. We talked about it recently, Matt, where and it stuck with me what you said. Until something is evidenced, you assume it's not being done.
Yeah,
and that is exactly the situation. So yes, in terms of what back ready looks like, 1, understanding what needs to be done, 2, demonstrating how it's done, 3, and most importantly, being able to provide that evidence at a moment's notice with up-to-date data. There's no point in presenting out-of-date testing commissioning information, for example. There's no point in realizing at the last minute that you've actually had a change of staff and your responsible person is not the same person that you've got written in your case. So it's just a case of going through that. But absolutely, I invite anyone that's got any concerns, or anyone maybe don't have any concerns, to put forward what you think is ready, and we will, as Matt said, be a friendly critic, if you will, rather us than someone else.
Absolutely. So, and then we move on from that, which is then the sort of status of maturing, which is, if we think of back ready, it wouldn't be version 1, but let's say it was version 1, and then you're sort of saying, well, going forward, we're having mandatory occurrences, we're re-looking at our risk assessments, incidents are happening. So, for example, hit the news a couple of days ago with a high-risk building in Holborn, where a balustrade failed and a young chap fell to his death, 5 stories, etc., etc. So you would be looking at that and saying, well, actually, what impact does that have on my portfolio? And you might go back and say, actually, we need to add an extra risk into our safety case. We need to put additional mitigations, which is checking of balustrades or whatever for all those buildings that have them. And then, so that would then you would issue another version of the safety case, or the safety case report. So that's a part of the maturity. And again, when the regulator is looking, when, let's say you've been back ready for 2 years and it's now 2 years later, you would expect, or I would expect, if I was inspecting, to see some progression in that safety case regime, not exactly what I would have read 2 years ago. So can you prove to me that is maturing, and what is your process through the safety management system to mature the approach? And then the kind of the dream scenario, if you like, in terms of delivering this reliably, consistently, and at a cost-effective price, is this sort of automation, how much of this process can we automate going forward? So not today, and we're not going from thinking to automation in one hit. This is an evolution over time. This is looking at areas of responsibility and saying, actually, what could we do? What data could we use to actually automate a part of this process? And certainly what we're doing as a business is always looking at saying, where there is lots of heavy lifting to do with a human being, is there a way of doing this through some form of automation? And by doing that, can we actually reduce the cost of delivery? This applies on the PAP side, so the building safety manager side, but also I would say if anybody from the regulator or government is listening, that this absolutely needs to happen on the other side of the fence as well. An example of that at the moment is that when you have to submit information to the regulator from your golden thread, which is your single source of truth, that is, I have one version of my fire risk assessment, for example, and it's on the golden thread, and people can look at the golden thread and they can read it, and they know that that's the latest version. When the regulator asks for a copy of your fire risk assessment, you have to take a copy of it and upload it into their system. So we've now got two versions of the truth. And if the fire service want one, there's a third version, for example. We absolutely need to be eating our own lunch as a regulator as well. And that is looking at the single source of truth and making a decision based on it, not asking PAPs to duplicate information. So that is my plea to the regulator if they ever watch this. Think about that data exchange, think about efficiency in the process. Let's all work together to not take 52% longer over a back determination than everybody agreed it should take in the worst case scenario. There is an efficiency problem here in the process. Some of it undoubtedly will be with the PAPs not being ready and not submitting the correct information at the time of assessment, and some of it will be with the regulator being inefficient and having productivity problems. So I think between both sides of that equation or that marketplace, we need to work together and we need to iron out those inefficiencies as far as possible, because ultimately we need to get all of these buildings assessed as quickly as possible, and not overshoot the 5-year period, which in my view is far too long in the first place. So we need to get that done. So I think that's the plea there. So the question really for everybody to think about, and I don't expect everyone to come online and put their hand up and tell me where they are, but happy to do that privately, is kind of where are you on that scale? If you're a director of a resident management company and the managing agent saying, yeah, don't worry about it, we've got it all sorted. Has anybody tested that? Has anybody looked at their work and assured you, because it's your liability as a resident management company? If you're running a portfolio, are you relying on what people have told you? Have you got any tracking in place or reporting? How do you actually objectively measure where you are on this scale? One of the things you do not want to do is to have false assurance. I always prefer to be massively negative on my assurance and think, I've submitted that safety case report. It could have been so much better if only I had time to do X, Y, and Z, rather than thinking it's amazing and then heading for a fall. It can never be good enough. This should always be, I think Jill Kernick uses this term, chronic unease. So Jill wrote a book called Catastrophe after Grenfell. She's an expert in this area, and she talks about chronic unease, which is never feeling that you've got everything covered, you've got every base covered. You always want to be uneasy about what you've got in place and continuously improving your posture rather than just thinking you've got it all sorted and you've ticked the box, because pride comes before a fall. So we're going to hand over to questions. Hopefully we've got a few minutes. Yeah, we have. Has anybody got anything they want to raise? I'm really keen to get feedback, and if Richard, if you can keep an eye on hands and ask people to unmute, that would be great. Have we got anybody?
Whilst people are deciding what questions to ask, I just want to touch on a point parallel to that of your last comment, Martin, and that's feedback that I've been getting recently from my client base, in that once they've been through the process, once they've created the golden thread with Track My Risks, once they've put the case together under our consultant in this instance, they have a fundamental better understanding, more confidence, and ultimately a management tool that they didn't have before. And the feedback is, I wish I'd have done this a lot earlier, because now I understand where we were going wrong, and I can sleep a little bit better at night. And I think it's just important to say that this system that you provide, the consultation that I provide, as well as you, it removes a lot of doubt. It creates a very clear picture, and hopefully that gives people a much easier access to understanding their buildings risks as well.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Ben. I mean, I think it's not just about demonstrating to others, it's about demonstrating to yourselves that you understand, and even with sort of templated content that we find that we'll have a discussion, we'll have a heading in the sort of the template golden thread, and people will say, well, what's that and why would you have it? And then you have a discussion and they sort of say, well, yeah, we haven't got that, but I think we should, so we'll go and commission it. You know, those things are there for a reason. You might not have thought it through, but that's the sort of the sum of all the knowledge of all the ones we've done before. So we're constantly adding to that template to say this is something that's pertinent, and that does change. I mean, especially with the regulator recently, you know, in the last 6 months or so, they've been far more interested in structural information than they were at the start. And so it allows you to go, well, actually, you know, we've been through multiple waves of requests for information from the regulator on various buildings, and they all seem to be landing on some key issues that they're looking for, and we need to make sure that we've got something in that slot. You know, we need to answer that question. So then that builds the knowledge, and again, it does lead to safer buildings when you've been through this, but burying your head in the sand and not actually getting on and doing it is not acceptable, and I wouldn't advise that to anybody. Similarly, expecting that in a week you'll start and you'll have everything done is unrealistic. What we find with most clients is that we'll work through the process, and then, for example, they'll need to commission some procedure documents or risk assessments or whatever it is, or reports. And by the time you get that procured, you get it booked in, you get it back, you give feedback, etc., you might be talking about months before you can move some of that safety case on to the next stage. This isn't an overnight job. This is probably many months, if not years, worth of work to get back ready across the portfolio. And you need to make sure that you've got the right funding, of course, and the right partners around you to deliver that. I think we've got some Q&A been popping up. No, everything's gone quiet.
Yes, there is one.
Oh, there is, right. Okay, sorry. Thanks, Caroline.
Yeah, it's in the Q&A. Do you want me to read it out for you?
Yeah, please, if you could, because I can't see it on my screen.
So it's anonymous. What do you think about the general competence of building safety managers when it's not uncommon to have people with no relevant experience all in roles?
Well, if that's the case, that's a concern, number one. Number two, so putting aside the management, say when you submit your safety case report to the regulator, you have to demonstrate competence, and you have to show what people were responsible for which part of the report. That's part of the guidance. If you're saying I'm a taxi driver and I've contributed to the structural assessment of the building, I think it would be right for the regulator to query what competence taxi drivers have in structural engineering, as an example. So similarly, if a group of residents just put together without experience, put together a safety case report and submitted it, I would hope that the regulator would push back on that and say that this tome of work requires competent people. But in saying that, the competence requirements for building safety managers has all been removed from the legislation. So it's a difficult one. It's not something I would do. And if I was in a building where I felt that the building safety manager didn't know what they were doing or wasn't competent, I would be raising that as a concern. It's difficult to know. I mean, any thoughts from you, Ben?
Yeah, mirroring your comments really, Matt, but in practical terms, you know, I situation in the past, if you will, the recent past, where I was introduced to somebody of responsibility, and I said, okay, well, great, let's use this as an exercise. let's look at the competency. How do we demonstrate that competency? I.e., this person is making decisions within this building. How do I know, if I were the regulator, that they are in a position to make it? And following conversation, it became quite apparent that this person was competent. However, there was nothing to evidence that. And that was a friendly situation. If under pressure, if following a incident, and in less favourable circumstance, I wouldn't have liked to have been in the position of that particular building manager, because they couldn't evidence the competence of themselves or the staff in that building. So there's means and ways of doing it. Personally, I enjoy looking at people's CPD records. I enjoy looking at history of employment. I enjoy looking at any other, vocational qualifications, etc., that may lend it towards that. But ultimately, it comes down to the role that you're doing, and it comes down to, if you're going to make a decision that could affect the safety of people, residents or otherwise, what gives you the capability to make a good decision? Demonstrate that to me, so that I can demonstrate it to the regulator within the case.
And I think just building on that point, there's somebody spoke to me a few weeks ago where they're a PAP, principal accountable person, and they'd had some refusal notices, and the higher echelons of the organisation were quite relaxed about the refusal notices, because they said, well, those buildings are managed by a managing agent. It's their problem. Now, operationally, day to day, it might be, but the reality is the PAP still has the legal liability. And quite often I see this where PAPs are just handing this off to a managing agent as a part of their managing agent activity, when they haven't actually asked what is the competence of the people. Who are you putting on this? How are you paying them? What are you doing? They're just sort of saying, well, I've handed that over to a managing agent. You may well hand the operational task, but you are not handing off the liability. That liability sits with you as the PAP. So it's a good point. Next one.
There's a question in the chat channel from Melissa. Melissa, did you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask Ben your question?
Sure. Hi. So do you know of any organizations that are educating the residents or the leaseholders on what their buildings require, or what building safety reports even are? And that's actually for either of you.
It's a good question, Melissa. Thank you. It brings me on to sort of a separate point, but on the same basis of resident engagement. I think in terms of it's interesting, actually. So when I do my job, part of what I do with people that are less sure of their position is go and physically measure buildings. One of the biggest questions I get is, do I have a HRB? Do I have a high risk building? And sometimes they don't know the height of it, etc., so on and so forth. And inevitably, when you're doing that, you bump into people that ask why you're there. Or why you're here, why you're measuring this building, why you're doing this, why you're doing that. And I have conversations with those people about what the Building Safety Act is and what it requires, etc., and so on and so forth. And they find it interesting, but equally some people find it concerning, because when you use the words high risk and building in the same sentence, and they are tenants of that building, they wonder whether they've got any added responsibility, etc., so on and so forth. So I think in summary, it's important to communicate with residents how the building operates, and it's important that they've got a line of communication into you. In fact, it's more than important, it's essential, and it needs to be evidenced that the communication between building managers and residents is there. Issues can be escalated and closed out proficiently. But in terms of generally advising people on the status of the building, outside of safety issues, I think that's an individual choice for the building manager. Does that answer your question, or have I worked up on a tangent there?
No, it's good. Can I build on that, Ben?
Please do.
Because I think there's the legal argument that says the answer to the question is everybody should, even if the building is not a higher risk building under the Building Safety Act. So that then falls into the Fire Safety England regulations, which applies to building of all heights, and there is minimum kind of information around fire safety, evacuation information, the right height around, and fire door information. So that should be communicated, and evidence of that communication should be prominently displayed. And then in higher rise buildings or higher risk buildings, monthly safety checks and the results of those should be prominently displayed as well under that part of the legislation, and then into the Building Safety Act through resident engagement. That also flows into, it's not really, and in terms of what building safety reports are, there are duties for principal accountable persons to share information to residents under the keeping and provision of information regs under the Building Safety Act, where a simplified version of the building safety case report, the fire risk assessment, etc., are kind of mandatory requirements for information sharing. And there are a lot of legal rights for residents as well around those. Now, saying that, they are theoretical legal rights that I haven't seen any evidence of any enforcement yet, or contested assertions of those rights, those rights not being met and going to court. It's not to say that they haven't, I haven't seen them. So I think it's very poorly understood, I think, from a resident perspective about what their rights are, and also similarly probably poorly understood in the building safety management community about what those residents' rights are and how to meet them. So I think at the moment it's sort of, from what I'm seeing, it's, well, if somebody comes and asks for it, I'll let them have it, but we're not going to give too much at the moment. Let's see how it all pans out, rather than saying, here's everything that's listed as a mandatory requirement and it's automatically available to everybody immediately. So we're in a bit of a standoff at the moment, I think, in terms of that.
Thank you for that question, Melissa. We have another one from Tom. Tom says, you mentioned the cost of 15 to 25k per year per HRB. Do you have an idea of what that converts to in cost per flat? Well, I think I know the answer to that, but Matt, do you want to? I would need to do the maths. There are approximately, according to the public register of HRBs that we have the data behind, just over 1 million residential dwellings in HRBs. So on average, I think it's about 100 and just over. I'd need to work out the maths, but there are, hang on one sec, I'll be able to tell you. No, I can't at the moment. I would imagine it's probably £300 or £400 per flat per year, maybe. Well, I need to. One of the things probably is to come back and answer that question after doing a bit of maths, because buildings are of varying sizes. This is, at the moment, the buildings that have gone through this process are at the larger end of the scale as well. That's the other thing to consider, because of the way they were called forward. So all those determinations so far in the £23,000 regulatory fees are based on what would be deemed to be complex buildings. In the impact assessment, there were 3 types of buildings, sort of simple, average and complex or something. Each one had a different target number of hours for the regulatory fees. So we're likely to be at the most expensive end of the spectrum at the moment because of the way that these buildings are being called forward. But it's probably going to be in the hundreds of pounds on average, I would have thought. Based on the raw data, the cost, if you're looking at the higher end of the market, as you said, it's a cost variance of between about £200 and £350 per annum per flat. Yeah.
And the thing to bear in mind with that is if you've had to go out and spend £30,000 on a retrospective fire strategy or a compartmentation survey or a structural assessment or whatever, those costs aren't included within what we've mentioned there. So the likelihood is in the early phases of getting back ready, you will see a big increase in cost in any given year to pay for those things. What we've effectively done is amortized some of those costs over a 5-year period. So in year 2, if you receive an invoice for £23,000 of regulatory fees, that would be paid within that year. In our assumption, we've smoothed that over a 5-year period. So it could well be that in year 1, a resident's recharged £200, then year 2 is £1,000, and then it drops down to 300, for example. It might be that kind of shape. it might not necessarily be amortized. And my understanding of the way that service charges work is that it's very difficult to deal with prepayments unless you're reserving money, and then there's rules around what can be reserved and what can't. And at this point, I'm straying out of my lane into managing agent world, which I'm not in, but that's the way it's been explained to me. This is why you get these peaks and troughs of cost. I hope that sort of answers the question. Okay, have we got any more? Got a thumbs up. So I would be very keen, I'll wrap up because we've got a couple of minutes left, but I would be very keen if anybody wants to reach out to myself or Ben as a result of this, please do on all channels. Very keen to talk to anybody that wants to get involved in the benchmarking and share with us the types of costs they're incurring, how many properties they've got, so we can actually then start to sort of feed into the model and actually hopefully publish a much more reliable or tighter range of cost. And the idea would be that we would keep going with that tracking and benchmarking, so we can sort of see, I would hope, the cost per HRB per year on average would reduce over time. We will have to see, and that would be one of the measures. We've got 5th of March will be our next luncheon. And again, if anybody's got any ideas on subject matter, please let me know. We have had a few requests for doing something on mandatory occurrence reporting. So we may well do that on the 5th of March, to be decided. But if anyone else has got any other topics they would like to talk about, that would be great. And we will send a link out for that, and we'll send you a copy of today's presentation and a link to the YouTube channel to watch it back if you've missed it. And if we don't speak to you before, we'll see you on the 5th of March, hopefully. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, Ben, for giving up your time and joining us from your hotel down in London. And look forward to seeing everybody again in a month's time. Thank you very much.